So, welcome to the Anything Gender podcast. I'm your host, Sharmin Prince, and this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And today we're going to have a critical conversation with our guests. And Domestic Violence Awareness Month is a time that is dedicated to recognize and address this pervasive issue of domestic violence. This month serves as a powerful reminder of the critical need for awareness, education, and action to support survivors and prevent further abuse. Domestic violence is defined as an abusive behavior in any relationship used by one partner to gain or maintain control over another intimate partner. The statistics are alarming. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men in the United States have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. On a typical day, more than 20,000 phone calls are placed to the Domestic Violence Awareness Hotline nationwide. 70% of domestic violence incidents result in physical injury. Today, we have the opportunity to amplify the voice of a survivor. This conversation aims to shed light on personal narratives, offering insight into the realities of domestic violence and the resilience of those of us who have endured and overcome it. By sharing our stories, we strive to foster understanding, empathy, and active support within our communities. Thank you for joining us as we delve into this critical dialogue, bringing necessary attention to Domestic Violence Awareness Month and contributing to the ongoing efforts to combat domestic violence. Together, we can make a difference. Now, my guest is Leticia R Francis. And at the age of 14, Leticia entered into a relationship with a man more than twice her age, who later married her. And that was the beginning of the turbulence she experienced in life for nearly 2 decades. Despite her story being full of unbelievable events, she's grateful for every experience as they brought her closer to her purpose. Now, as an advocate against abuse, a mindset coach, and a market research strategist, she's passionate about helping women finally exit survival mode so they can start thriving, experiencing the fulfillment they desire in their lives. Leticia, welcome to the Anything Gender podcast. And is there anything that you would like to add to that bio?
First of all, thank you so much for having me and facilitating such an important conversation. And the only thing that I would add to that bio is I don't consider myself a survivor. I tell people I thrived despite the abuse that I endured. And for that, I'm grateful because it's allowed me to be a voice to those who are voiceless. Abuse is a silent suffering. And I think this conversation is so important to, mark the fact that it's October, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but it's a conversation that we need to have 12 months a year because it's so prolific and we don't go deep enough into these conversations. So thank you.
You're welcome. Why do you think we don't go deep enough into these conversations?
I think there is a lack of understanding. I'm not even going to say that. I'm going to call it a spade a spade. There is blanket ignorance in relation to abuse. And as a result, people don't take it seriously enough. I know from my circumstances and my situation, because of the age difference, I was blamed for the atrocities that I experienced. And that came as a direct result of the ignorance in relation to abuse. So because people are not aware of how hard hitting and the residual impacts of abuse, it's easy to brush it over. It's similar to drug addiction, right? We only care when it's our family members. We only care when it hits home. And that mindset is often why a lot of people stay, because there's not enough compassion, there's not enough empathy for people who are experiencing this. So it's easy to keep quiet. It's easy to ignore and sweep under the rug because essentially we've grown up in cities where we've made it okay to keep what happens behind closed doors. And in some instances, that's fine. I don't want my 5 and 6-year-old out here slinging my business in the streets. However, when it comes to protecting me as a human, this is my basic human right. It's often ignored because of where the violence happens. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you. You've raised so many points, and I want to highlight the impact of socialization, because a child may have heard you don't take what happened in the home out of the home. And because it was not in context, you become a teenager and you still have that belief system that what happens behind closed door remains there. So when you're being abused, you don't want to let anyone know. And also the shame and the guilt that is attached to it. You want to unpack that a little?
Oh, gosh. So speaking from my own experience, the very first time I experienced any sort of violence in my relationship, I was 15. And I knew that that is not how relationships should be. I knew a man should not put his hands on me. Because of the dynamics of my relationship and the age gap, I was forced to keep my relationship kind of under wraps in the first place. So there was this guilt that I wasn't supposed to be in this space in the first place. And the shame associated with, this is not a healthy situation, yet you're doing nothing about it. So as a person experiencing this, there is this battle internally because there is an awareness that I shouldn't be hit. I shouldn't be treated like this. But what do I do? Especially if maybe one time I might have mentioned it to a friend and they shamed me or judged me. It increases this feeling of guilt and shame because you are forced to hide what's actually going on with you. Because you can't trust that people are going to be empathetic and compassionate and provide a solution that isn't attached to judgment.
How could let's say our listeners may say, well, I don't know how to provide support without judgment. As a survivor, in those moments when you're sharing either with friends or family, what tips can we give to our listeners on providing support without judgment?
I think it comes down to understanding that our role in life is not always to offer solution. Oftentimes, I think the reason why people insert judgment is because they're trying to find a solution. So they're walking through their limited knowledge of how to help in a situation. And it's understandable. I think most people come from a point, from a good intention. But because there is a lack of understanding and a lack of knowledge, they often try to insert solutions that are not always valid. And I think this is very important for the listeners to understand. Until a person is ready to walk away from their situation, you can beg, plead, you can shame, you can do whatever you like. It will not change the actions of the victim. They have to be ready. And I always cycle back to drug addiction, right? It's the same with an addict. Until they reach rock bottom and they're ready to change their lives, it's fallen on deaf ears. So with that in mind, offer a listening ear. Ask permission to provide a solution. Ask permission to provide inputs. But other than that, sit and listen. Because sometimes all a victim needs is to be seen and heard.
Thank you for that, because that is so important. And oftentimes we're hearing, I don't even know if we're listening, we're hearing to fix. But sometimes I may not need you to fix what's happening. As you said, I just want to be heard and seen. And according to the statistics, a woman leaves 7 times until she finally leaves for good. And there's a lot of shaming when women return to the abuser or the perpetrator. How can we help our listeners to understand that within the abusive relationship, there is codependency for whatever reason? And a victim returning, it's not that she's stupid or she likes the abuse, because I heard that. It's because there is a level of codependency. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so victims, let's just say humans in general, we get attached to what becomes our status quo. Oftentimes we operate in chaos, but that's usual for us. We operate in toxic environments, but that becomes usual for us. When we are immersed in circumstances for quite a long time, we learn to adjust our lives and our behaviors and the way that we show up in the world so that it's congruent with the environment that we find ourselves in. So leaving often puts us in a place of familiarity. I can't really say that word. And it's very uncomfortable. So we go back to what we know. Part and parcel to that codependency, if we are relying on an external factor to provide us happiness, once that is removed, we often cannot function. So we return back to that place that is providing us the happiness, even if it comes with chaos and toxicity. So walking away is not something that happens right away. It's not something that someone does without prior planning. You need time to adjust to that new normal. And oftentimes that new normal, even though it's healthy, is terrifying because it's attached to the unknown.
Thank you. We have a victim who is currently in that situation listening to the podcast. What do we say to them?
First, I want to say that you are not alone in the things that you are experiencing. Abuse often has us feeling like we are an island, that we are isolated and no one understands. But there are communities of people who have overcome what you have overcome. And we are here speaking up so that you have a voice. I want you to know with certainty that better times are coming. And it comes down to you making a decision what you want for your life. And it's really hard sometimes because I don't want to push an agenda on anybody, because I understand that until you're ready, it's going to fall on deaf ears. But I think the most important thing to say is you are seen, you are heard, you are not alone, and help is available.
Thank you for sharing that. And if I may add, yes, you may not be ready, but creating that plan for when you're ready is important. What was that turning point for you that forced you to leave?
For me, it was being stabbed. And that was the reality for me. I had a plan in place, and I had a plan in place for almost 2 years. I had decided, I grew up in Bermuda, this abuse occurred in Bermuda, and I had planned to go to the US, apply for multiple universities, and tell him I was going to one university and I was actually going to another. That was my escape plan. He found out about it before that happened, and he told me that the only way that I was going to walk out of that relationship, or the only way that I was going to leave that relationship, was in a body bag. Sitting after the incident, after being stabbed, I had nowhere to go for that night, for that period. And I was taken to a homeless shelter by the police. And I was sitting in a cold room alone, recognizing that someone who loved me would not draw a knife on me. Someone who loved me would not draw blood from me. Someone who loved me would not lie about stabbing me while they still had my blood on their shirt. That was what made me realize that I have been blinded all this time. There was no love there. This man tried to kill me. But until that happened, I always justified it. Maybe I'm too little cheeky. I got too much mouth. I created this circumstance. But sitting alone with no help from my family, sitting alone, having to be honest with my employer that my husband just stabbed me, sitting alone helped me realize that I was in a circumstance that was going to kill me if I did not leave.
Thank you for sharing that. And could we just take a deep breath? So just let's take a deep breath in and out. Another deep breath in and out. Thank you. And after that incident and you walked away, what were some of the residual effects of that domestic violence relationship? Because it's not something we talk about.
No. That is because I entered into that relationship at such a young age, but a pivotal time in my development. Walking away from that marriage, I was naive in thinking simply walking away would solve my problems. However, I am now an adult, and for the first time as an adult, I was forced to define who I was. Before that relationship, I was someone's child. For 7 years, I was someone's girlfriend, someone's fiance, or someone's wife. Now that that relationship ended, my relationship with my parents have been severed. I didn't know who I was as an adult. And it should have been seen as a great opportunity to redefine myself. But because I didn't get help right away, I thought just simply walking away was the solution. I was left sitting in those raw emotions that I have been carrying for years. The shame, the guilt, the anger, the disappointment in self. And what that looked like for me was alcohol abuse and promiscuity. I laid my trauma on a bed, or I laid my trauma on the bar, and I was functioning, but I was spiraling, and I didn't realize it at that point because the immediate threat was gone, but the damage it did to the internal portions of me, it amplified. Without that support, without that help, I just swept it up. I got to pick myself up, and I had to keep going. So what it looked like was being on a conveyor belt through hell with no way to get off. I wouldn't stay at home because I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts. So I was out in the streets. I was out in the bars. I was out in someone's bed to silence the noise that was going on in my head. And that went on for 15 years. So key to note, my abuse lasted 7. The residual impacts lasted twice as long. And the only thing that forced me to get help was I had found myself in another relationship very similar. There was no physical abuse, but there were financial abuse because he was an addict. There was emotional abuse because I was dealing with an addict. And I ended up in jail as a result. And my mom came to visit me in jail. And she said to me, why do you love everyone else more than you love yourself? That was a Mike Tyson body blow. She winded me with that comment. But it was the realization, like, I need to learn how to put myself first. I don't know how to do that. My ability to do that was stripped away from me during the abuse. But it's my responsibility to figure it out. And it was me working with a coach and a counselor to work through my trauma, to come to terms with my trauma before I was able to reduce the residual impacts of the abuse. And the reason why I say reduce is because I'm not rid of it. I'm still triggered. I'm still triggered. I still struggle with trust, right? But because I have worked through my trauma, I'm aware of my triggers.
Right.
I'm aware of why I tend to be on the back foot with people, which allows me to make different decisions. But that residual impact is everlasting. And it's a word for it. It's survival mode. We get stuck in fight and flight without realizing it. And that's how we show up every day, every single day, looking for this threat that may or may not exist.
There's so much to unpack from what you said. Because oftentimes we believe that we're out of the relationship, we're in a program, and after that we're fine. I remember years ago saying to someone, not because you went to a program, you're healed. And especially if it's an inpatient program, because when you leave the inpatient program, you're exposed to all the triggers, things that threatened you in the past, all the things that can re-traumatize you. And it's important to have follow-up support. So I just want to thank you for unpacking so much about the residual impact of DV, and for being so vulnerable and honest. Healing from trauma it's a process. And even though it might have been tears, I had a flashback earlier. That's why I asked that we breathe. And I think that I have been healed. I think that I've overcome. I can identify my traumas, but this is not a conversation that we have often. I can speak for me because, you mask it.
Someone said something very interesting to me that it made sense, right? And it's two parts. First of all, trauma lives within the body. And it is just like energy, right? Energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be transferred, right? Trauma acts in the same way. If we don't address our trauma, it stays in our body and it shows up. It transfers into our actions, into our behaviors, into who we become as humans. But the other part of that, which is why the healing journey is so important, but the other part of that is healing is not a destination. It is an ongoing journey. And oftentimes because you said it just now, and it's not me, poking at it, but you said, I thought I was healed. We never heal because our trauma never dies. So it's a daily battle similar to addiction. We have to make a choice not to fall victim to the traumas that we have experienced, to live beyond that. And in doing so, holding ourselves accountable to be the highest version of ourselves, which means that we need to embrace healing on a daily basis.
Beautiful, because as you're speaking, I usually say healing, it's like the onion. You peel the first layer, and it may take another 5 years for you to get to the second layer. And and then until you get to the core, and you may never get to the core. Also, there's new research on the epigenetics of trauma, where we have it in our genes, our foreparents, others who live in an era where don't hang your dirty laundry in public. They didn't process their traumas, but they handed it to us genetically. So here we are, exposed to domestic violence and whatever other traumas, and we are dealing with ours and those of our foreparents.
Which is why it's so important to heal,
Yes,
right?
ma'am.
Because trauma can be passed down for 8 generations. 8.
That.
That's a lot of years. And if we are compounding trauma on top of that, my great granddaughter is going to be in trouble if I don't spend the time to heal, right? I lived my granny's trauma for years, and not because she experienced abuse. She experienced torment in relation to racism, which then got passed on to me as the strong Black woman. You don't see, no one sees your weakness. That to some may be like something to celebrate. But with compounded trauma, I'm at home getting my ass beat. But I can't let my wig slip. Why? Because I'm holding on to my granny's trauma. I've developed this wall that I celebrate because I'm this strong Black woman, unbreakable. But that's not my trauma. That's my granny's. So understanding that we have a responsibility to ourselves and to future generations, to this world, to heal ourselves, having that information in mind.
Yes. What are the first steps to healing, to encourage victims who have experienced domestic violence? I've heard persons said, I don't need to speak to anyone. I don't need counseling. I don't need therapy. I don't need coaching. But when you listen to them, when you see their behaviors, you're confronted with their traumas. How do we speak to them?
Awareness is key, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back to that ignorance. Ignorance is bliss. Awareness is key. If they are unaware that they are operating in their trauma, there's nothing to change for them. And it may be me being a really good friend and calling you up on your behaviors because I need you to be aware that you're not operating in your higher self. You are operating from a place of trauma. I can't make you see that. I can't make you embrace that. But I think we have a responsibility to those we love to be honest. We also have a responsibility to ourselves to be honest. And oftentimes, the reason why we are able to operate so deeply in the deep-rooted trauma that we experience is because it masks the fact that we often don't know ourselves as a result of the trauma. We often don't trust ourselves as a result of the trauma. We often don't like ourselves as a result of the trauma, and we don't accept our trauma.
Hmm. Hmm.
So the first steps is getting to know, like, trust, and accept yourself. Owning what you've been through is the first key. And the reason why I don't call myself a victim is because I recognize that victim mentality is what kept me stuck for 15 years. As long as you identify as a victim, you are not in control of the actions you take in life. So it's really about coming to terms with what you've gone through, reducing the labels that you attach to yourself as a result of what you've gone through, and spending that time getting to know who you are outside of those labels that you might have already placed on yourself, outside of the trauma that you might have experienced, outside of the shame that people might have dumped on you as a result. Getting to know who you are, not defining that by societal means, but by what makes you feel good inside. Once you have identified who you are and who you want to be, start liking yourself. And that may not be easy. Most of us don't like the person that's looking back in the mirror, but taking time to spend that time to nurture that in a relationship, start loving you despite your flaws, getting to accept that although you have been through these experiences, they do not define where you go next. And if you can do that, be honest with yourself, that's when you start to transfer that trauma into something that's going to serve you and where you want to go. And I think it all comes down to that vision of what you want for your life beyond the experience.
So, if I heard you correctly, can we say that it is important to have self awareness, develop self confidence, do the work with the process of self discovery, peeling those layers, masking, because domestic violence or any kind of trauma forces us to wear the mask. And oftentimes we believe that the mask we wear is who we are. What caused you to become an advocate?
So interesting. I started a business and I struggled for many years with being seen. And I couldn't understand why. And in a conversation with someone who simply asked me a question like, where did it start for you struggling to be seen, was when I realized my trauma was showing up again.
Hmm.
And the way that it showed up was like, I actually couldn't draw an instant parallel until somebody questioned me. But in the journey of being okay with being seen, it was suggested that I start sharing my story. And this was really just to get me comfortable with what may come with any type of exposure. So I started telling my story, and I actually didn't think that my story was, earth shattering. I didn't think anything of it. But the feedback that I got as a result was like, wow, this is life changing. And I decided to write a book. I wrote a memoir, which is yet to be published. And in writing, it was like, this story isn't mine, meaning I believe in a higher power. I believe in God. And I believe that everything that we go through is actually a masterclass for someone else. That's what I think self-actualization is, right? Like, you go through life, you learn these lessons, and then you pass those lessons on to someone else. I don't care about a pyramid. I just think it's getting to a state in life where you realize that your uniqueness can be impactful to others. So as I processed the feedback, I realized, you know what? This is my calling. Like, I didn't struggle for 20 plus years to just sit silent. And I've always been told I'm too much, I'm too loud, I'm too this, I'm too that. So why don't I use my loudness to speak up for people who can't speak for themselves? Why don't I use my too muchness to be bold enough to speak about things that no one wants to talk about? And I came to that realization that every part of me was born to advocate for someone else. Every part of my story was meant to be used for someone else. And that's my purpose in life. I believe that we're all here to change the world in some way. My closing quote for almost every podcast I've ever done is walk as if every step you take is about to create an avalanche, because boo, you are here to change the world. And I would be a hypocrite if I wasn't stomping through life as a result of being able to thrive beyond the things that I have experienced.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to share with our listeners?
I want to just encourage everyone on the back of that last conversation that it is our responsibility to turn our mess into our message, our test into our testimony, and our experiences into hope and inspiration for someone else. And I'm not encouraging you to get on the next podcast, but I'm encouraging you to be honest with yourself and think about how you can be impactful to others, because everything that we go through in life is meant to define who we are tomorrow. Embrace who you can be tomorrow, but in the same breath, give back in some way, even if it's you smiling to someone on the street that you know is having a bad day, or offering an ear to someone to listen. You don't have to be as impactful as other people in this space, but just think, you survived for a reason. You are alive for a reason. How can you celebrate that in a way that also helps someone else?
Thank you so much, Leticia.
You're welcome.
This has been the Anything Gender podcast, and we thank you for your time, and we thank you for sharing, liking, and subscribing. We'll see you next time.